Hi, everyone. Good to be back with you. Hope you're having a wonderful start to your week. Hope you had a blessed Easter as you celebrated the resurrection of Jesus. It was great to see so many of you in worship this past weekend at all of our services. But we're going to dive right into it today. We got a number of questions. I got a number of questions dealing with maybe some things we read in Deuteronomy 19, questions that all kind of revolved around how God dealt with murder in the Old Testament. And some of you had questions about the cities of refuge that were instituted. Some of you had questions about this mythical person referred to as the Avenger of Blood. Some of you wondered about this command that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, and like how does that jive with what Jesus said in Matthew 5? That it's not about an eye for an eye, it's about turning the other cheek. So what are we supposed to do with these passages? How do we apply them to our lives today? What are we to make of the death penalty in the modern American 21st century world? It seems like it was okay back then, but what about for us now? So I don't know that I'll have a clear-cut answer for all of these things, but maybe I can at least give you some things to consider. And so what I'd like to do in our time today, this video might be a couple minutes longer than usual, but I think it's worth the time. Three things I'd like to talk about with you. First, how did God handle issues of murder in the Old Testament? Like, how did he deal with that? Second, what does that tell us about who God is and what he's like? I think that's really important to think about. And then third, what do we do with that today? How do we take these Old Testament passages and apply them to our lives? Do we at all, or do we just kind of dismiss them? Is there any deeper wisdom there? So, how did God deal with murder? What does that reveal about him? And what do we make of it today? Again, we're going to take a look at Deuteronomy 19 as one of the primary places where this is talked about, even though it's found in other places too. And one of the first things we see in the way that God deals with it is that he does it in a very fair and orderly way, right? So Deuteronomy 19, verse 15 says, "One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of a crime or offense they have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses." So God has a very fair, orderly, and just way of taking care of this. If someone ends up dead, and now there's all these accusations thrown around who did it, right? That there's a process to go through. He doesn't just say to his people, "You figure it out. Good luck with this," or "It doesn't matter if it happens," right? No, he sets us a system. It's fair. It's orderly. And he goes on in that passage. Verse 16 continues with what this trial is supposed to look like. So that's how God begins to deal with it. Now let's say that the person accused is found innocent. Or maybe they had a part to play in the death of someone, but it wasn't like cold-blooded murder. It was an accident, right? Something happened and it was not their intent. Well, what God does is he sets up these cities of refuge. And these were scattered about Israel. And these were places where those people, again, maybe they're innocent or maybe they were part of it, but it wasn't intentional. These cities of refuge they could run to for refuge so that the angry, upset, revenge-seeking family and friends of the deceased person, that they wouldn't go chasing after them and maybe commit another murder in revenge. And so these cities of refuge were set up to protect God's innocent people, right? Again, God is handling things very fairly in a very orderly way, not haphazardly. He's kind of thought through some different scenarios on what this could look like, and he sets things in place for that. Now, if the trial happens and the person is found guilty, God has some conditions for that too. This is where the Avenger of Blood comes in. It seems like there was someone set apart in the community, at least one person, whose job it was to exact that justice. I wouldn't want that job, but someone had to do it, and so there was someone who would come and enact the death penalty upon the murderous person. And this comes back to what Jesus says in verse 21. He says, "This is how it's going to be: a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot." Now that might sound harsh to us, but many scholars have recognized that this was actually a gracious way of dealing with sin. Other cultures didn't handle it this nicely. If someone cut off their hand, you might go for their head. It's not exactly fair, but what God is saying is the punishment has to fit the crime, right? You can't just uh, go crazy and start seeking revenge on people in a way that doesn't match with what happened, right? So again, you can't cut off someone's head just if they cut off your finger. If someone robs a candy bar from a store, right? They don't deserve the death penalty. The punishment has to fit the crime. And of course, he says he does all of this in verse 13, that the reason why he says, show no pity, you must purge from Israel the guilt of shedding innocent blood so that it may go well with you. The reason why God is a God of orderly and fairness and justice is because he doesn't want sin, particularly the sin of murder, to flourish and grow. He knows that it needs to be dealt with. And it's not maybe easy for some of us to think of a God allowing other people to be killed, a capital punishment, right? But again, he doesn't want sin to grow and fester and get out of control. So he's put very clear ways of dealing with it. Excuse me, and handling it. Okay, so this is how he handles with it. And what does that reveal about him? I think everything we just said. God is a God of order, of fairness, and justice. He seeks justice for his wronged people. And don't we all want that deep down inside? If someone hurts us and wrongs us, or we see children being hurt or loved ones suffering, right? We want justice for them. We want the person who is hurting them to be punished and for that to stop and then not just continue to grow. And we want that, and God gives it. He cares about justice and righteousness, right? He wants to right the wrongs of his people and lift them up. So we learn a lot of important things about God. Now, some of you are wondering, what in the world does this have to do with me, right? How do I apply this to my life today? And some of you brought up the fact that while Deuteronomy 19 says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, Jesus says, look, you've heard it said eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, if someone wrongs you, you turn the other cheek and do not resist the evil person. So what in the world is going on here? Well, again, I don't have a lot of clear-cut answers, but maybe some things for us to think about. The truth is that eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth command, while it was meant to curb and kind of prohibit cruel revenge, in some cases, people use that command as an excuse to exact revenge, right? As a means of saying, look, brother or sister, you hurt me, now I'm going to hurt you back, right? And Jesus is saying that's not how it is to be amongst us as brothers and sisters in Christ, right? That there is another way. Uh, Justice and orderliness and fairness is important to God still, because he's the same God, Old and New Testament. Um, but if you think that that Old Testament command from Deuteronomy 19 was just giving you a license to lash out and hurt other people when they hurt you, it's not like that. And so God is still just and he's still fair. But I think we're also seeing that he's also a God of mercy and compassion, and that cold-hearted, compassionless justice was never the goal, right? Redemption is always the goal. And that ought to change how we live. What also changes how we live is that we have Jesus, right? He's died for us. He's risen for us. We just celebrated that this Easter, right? And we just can't live the same way. When you have the peace and the hope and the life of Jesus, that ought to change how you live. And that's what he's talking about in Matthew 5 when he talks about turning the other cheek, right? That you can let people take things from you because you know you have even greater things from Jesus. So I know maybe I just muddied the waters for you a little bit. I don't think Jesus is saying, all right, whatever happens, happens. Just let bad people continue to do bad things. Just let murder happen. Throw up your hands and look the other way. I don't think he's saying that. I think he's just saying that married to that sense of justice and fairness is also meant to be a sense of compassion and mercy. And married to that is this new life we have in Jesus that ought to overflow out of us. That again, I think Jesus is reminding us that cold-hearted, compassionless justice was never the total goal, right? Redemption always was. Now, having said that, again, when I think about my kids, if I saw someone hurting one of my children, I wouldn't read Matthew 5 and say, okay, don't resist an evil person. Okay, if you're going to hurt one of my kids, just take another one too, right? I don't think we're meant to just let foolishness and evil flourish and grow, that there's still a place for justice today. But again, Jesus is reminding us there's also a place for mercy. There's a place for compassion. And we always ought to be thinking about how can I bring restoration and redemption. And Jesus is telling us, even when someone hurts us, that doesn't mean that we have to seek their eye or their tooth or their hand in revenge, that there is a place for grace and forgiveness. And sometimes I think we lose sight of that. We want it to be either or. Either you're just or you're merciful. And with Jesus, I think there's room for both. And that's messy sometimes. But that's, I guess, the mess that he's left us with. There's also this passage from Romans 13, 4 to 5, that I think could be helpful for us as we think about what are the implications for us today. Like, is the death penalty still okay? And so this is what Paul wrote to the Romans. He says, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Paul's reminding the Romans here. And remember, Rome is cruel and wicked. He wasn't writing this about some benevolent king, but he's saying, listen to Rome. They were actually placed there for your good. And that may be hard to believe, but Paul says you better believe it. It has been the traditional historic Lutheran view, then, that capital punishment is allowable. The governments have been given that power by God. But I guess I would invite us to just consider three things along with that. The first is that, yes, because of sin, we continue to need justice, and we continue to punish evil because we don't want it to flourish and grow and go out of control and live in some chaotic world. I don't want that. I don't think you want that either. But the second thing we need to remember is that God's goal is always redemption, that he's a merciful God who seeks the restoration and the wholeness of his people. And so while governments may have the power from God to punish severely, we have to think, is that the right or proper thing to do in every circumstance? I don't think we just give them a blank check, especially in a society, in a governmental system where we have been given some level of power as voting citizens, right? In this democratic republic we live in. We ought to bring our Christian values with us as we vote and make our voices heard about some things. Just because something is allowable doesn't mean that it's good and right and beautiful in every circumstance. And so we need to seriously consider whether that is a good thing that we want a part of our society right now. And we need to think that if we're going to allow capital punishment, how do we do that with the goal of redemption in mind? How do we do that not just out of some cold-hearted, compassionless sense of justice? We're going to punish evil because that's what you do because it's right. But how do we do that if we're going to, with a sense of redemption as the goal, of reflecting a merciful God, living in the fullness of what he has for us? Again, maybe I didn't give you too many answers, but hopefully some things to think about. God is good and right and true, but he's also kind and merciful and just. He doesn't want a world with chaos, but he also says that revenge and cold-hearted justice don't need to always be the answer. There's a place for grace and forgiveness and restoration. Uh, well, again, I hope I gave you some things to chew on this week. Thanks for all of your good questions. If you have any follow-ups for those of you that asked questions or anything I said here that made you think, please don't hesitate to send an email, click on the link in this email. I'll be happy to continue the conversation. God bless.